just for the public's information, David Santillo is a marine biologist. He's worked quite a number of years, 25 years if I understand, at the Greenpeace Research Laboratories, which is based at the University of Exeter. And obviously everyone knows Greenpeace as one of, probably as the most visible environmental organization, and so strong on advocacy on so many issues related to environment. So I'm not going to introduce Greenpeace because it's so well known, and so well known right now in the current context of the WAKASHIO oil spill. But just very briefly, as we know, Greenpeace is an NGO set up in 1971. It has a huge presence over the world, and we're very glad through Greenpeace Africa to have been put in touch with you. And I think you would be, from what I've heard, you're probably the best person that we could talk to on issues related to the oil spill, and just, I mean, in general, a bit your perspective on environmental issues, namely oil pollution. So very welcome to you, David. And I don't know whether you want to say a few words on yourself before we move to a few questions. So over to you.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. And yes, I'm part of the broader team of Greenpeace that is currently monitoring developments in Mauritius after this oil spill and the other activities that are following up. And we're also, of course, working closely with local NGOs and local people because it's vital that we keep that connection to the information that's coming forward, but also to the reality that people are facing on the ground in terms of the environmental pollution and in terms of the impacts that this is having on the livelihood of people in the area. So yeah, I'm one part of a broader team with a focus on the science and looking at the impacts and also the next steps moving forwards.
Excellent. Obviously, scientific credibility is very key in the work that Greenpeace does, and I think it's a very valuable unit that Greenpeace has, the science unit, or what we call the research lab. So my first question to you, David, would be, what would be your perspective on the increased maritime activities on this specific route, and what do you think Mauritius needs to be thinking of again in the future now, because of this current incident has already occurred, but what would Mauritius need to be thinking of when we're talking about the protection of its biodiversity and preventing these types of pollution happening in the Indian Ocean?
Yes, well, with any busy shipping route, there are always dangers, of course. There are the ongoing operational discharges and emissions from ships, which can impact on the environment and climate anyway. There is the noise pollution from busy shipping lanes. There's always the potential for ships to strike marine mammals, whales and dolphins and whale sharks. So these are all things that can go on at any time with busy shipping traffic lanes. But there's also, of course, always that danger that you have an accident of some sort, an accident of this nature, of course, where you have a spill of oil that has longer term consequences as well. Now, thankfully, there was no loss of life in this instance. The crew were safe, but now we're dealing with the consequences of that incident, and it seems to have been the case of a ship in the wrong place, not respecting the coastal protection of Mauritius. And now we're dealing with the consequences, and the local communities and the Mauritian government are dealing with that. Often when you have oil spills of this nature in inshore waters, in sensitive areas where you have shallow seas, a lot of important areas for biodiversity, that can really be a bigger issue from these oil spills, even if the volume of oil that's spilled is relatively low. This wasn't a tanker, this was a bulk carrier, so this is fuel oil we're talking about. Nonetheless, the implications can be long-term, and they can be quite devastating because of the sensitivity of the area in which this occurred. So what Mauritius, we feel, should be doing is a number of things. Firstly, it is possible to call for shipping to stay away from its coast, to avoid these sensitive areas. And there are precedents for that, where there have been oil spills in the past, even decades ago in Europe with some of the bigger oil spills, where areas, shipping lanes or areas that were used as innocent passage were closed or much more heavily restricted as a result of those oil spills. Now, sadly, it always seems to take a spill in order for those kinds of actions to be taken. But it would be perfectly within Mauritius government right at the moment to push for shipping traffic to stay much further offshore, to introduce perhaps mandatory piloting for ships that have to come in close to shore, but also to call more widely internationally within the International Maritime Organization, perhaps to look at setting up a particularly sensitive sea area. That also has been done before in other locations when in the event of an oil spill, and also then to strengthen its own system of marine protected areas. Now, at the moment, Mauritius has more than 30 marine protected areas, but they're all very small. They're not well integrated. They don't provide that level of protection that would be necessary in order to, looking forward to provide that integrated approach to preventing this kind of thing from happening in the future. So I think there's a number of things that Mauritius can be doing regarding shipping, which will help avoid this kind of thing happening in the future. Of course, for as long as we have ships sailing using fossil fuels, whenever there is an accident, there is always that potential for a spill of oil with these kinds of consequences. So in the longer term, we would hope that Mauritius would be among other governments that would be pushing for a move away from fossil fuels, even within the shipping industry, for propulsion. Lots of other mechanisms are under development to allow for that. And I think this is another example of why that's so important.
Well, that's very interesting what you say, David, because it seems as though these types of accidents at sea is not something which is just isolated. It seems that, I mean, it has raised maybe more awareness in our region, whereby we realize that there are many more maritime accidents, probably even more right now with COVID restrictions and all the different aspects related to that pandemic, rotations of the crew, for example, where the crew is maybe with fatigue, whether it applied to Mauritius or not. But it seems as though maritime accidents are just getting higher and higher. Last year, a similar island or small islands like Solomon Islands went through a similar experience actually in March of 2019. So I think you comment on the advocacy and bringing all countries together and really having a common stand on all these risks is very important. You mentioned the question of, you mentioned the issue of long-term effects, and particularly what is concerning for us all as Mauritians is to really understand what could be the long-term impacts on health, and health of human beings, but also of all these species that might be affected by that, again, the small scale of an oil spill, but there will be probably long-term effects on it. So what is your opinion on that, on some potential long-term impact or short-term impact of this oil spill?
Well, I think that largely remains to be seen. In terms of short-term impacts, of course, the presence of the oil can smother and suffocate species and poison species. Fuel oil is a toxic substance, and most marine life, when it comes into contact with it, is going to be badly affected. So the question really is just how extensive is that spread of oil? How much of it can be recovered? Can it be recovered without inadvertently making the problem worse through the use of toxic dispersants or very aggressive physical cleaning processes? The trouble with oil spills is that once they happen, they almost become an insoluble problem. You cannot clean up completely. You have to just deal with as much of the problem as you can in as low an impact way as you possibly can. But I think time will tell what the long-term impact is on the marine environment, and it's vital that the Mauritian government, but also the international community, will be able to help monitor those changes over time and look at areas of contamination and perhaps intervene where possible. The other issues relate, of course, to human health impacts. There's always the possibility that people who've been involved in the cleanup, especially if they've not had proper protective equipment, could suffer some short-term health impacts from that, and those can include skin irritation, breathing difficulties, in some cases dizziness, headaches, those kinds of things, and also the longer-term implications. So there are studies showing that even many years after people were involved in cleanup, that some of those negative symptoms can persevere and persist. So from that point of view, it's vital that the people that are affected, the communities affected, have access to good healthcare. They have support in dealing with any concerns that they have, so that they can address those as soon as possible. And this doesn't become just another point in the news, and that people then think that they can move on. The other thing to keep in mind, of course, is that those residues of the oil will, in some cases, stay in the marine environment for many, many years to come. So if people are relying on marine ecosystems as a source of food as well, there has to be that long-term monitoring to avoid people eating contaminated food as a result of this spill. And then more broadly, in terms of human health, there is the aspect of loss of livelihoods, people who are unable to do what they would normally be doing as a result of this spill. So those are wider liabilities, wider issues, but it is absolutely vital that as much as can be done as possible to support those communities moving forward into the future. The environment, I think, largely the damage is done, and will continue to be done. There may be very little that can be done in practice to remove the oil from some of those areas. So once again, unfortunately, we may be monitoring, the longer term effects of a spill rather than being able to clean it up completely.
Sure. I think the 3 points that you mentioned here is key, is impacts potentially on all these species that might be affected, the short and long-term impact on human health and those who have been more exposed, and that longer and indirect impact that it will have on livelihoods, and especially on the most vulnerable communities living around the area. So basically, long-term monitoring, as you say, is very important. And one of the objectives of these talks, David, is really to bring experts that either work in the field or have experienced similar oil spill disasters in other regions of the world, and provide their inputs, their expertise and knowledge to share with the Mauritian people, so that we can learn from these lessons learned and move forward on it. And one of the key points that comes over and over again is monitoring and research, and really an inclusion of all the people that have been affected in the decision making. So my last question to you, David, is what do you think in terms of some of the programs that Greenpeace has, or initiatives that Greenpeace has implemented in the world? I know of the Go Beyond Oil campaign, but there's so many other probably other programs that you've implemented that could be very relevant to for Mauritians, the government and the civil society to know about. So if you would want to maybe share just a few with us, that would be extremely useful. Thank you.
Well, yes, as you say, monitoring is going to be a very important issue going forward. But if all we do is monitor, then we're not really taking the opportunity to move forward as a result of this kind of spill. So one of the things that we haven't talked about so far, of course, is the sinking of the front part of the vessel, the bow part of the vessel, which was done very swiftly, without, as far as we can see, full transparency of how that decision was taken. And there has to be, of course, a commitment to monitor long-term the impacts of dumping that part of the vessel, which we haven't heard a lot about so far. Mauritius has obligations under international conventions and under the law of the sea in order to to justify its actions in that case, and also the other countries that were involved. And it's absolutely critical that we also now understand what will happen to the stern part of the vessel. You know, that's being deconstructed, it's being decontaminated. You know, let's not have the same situation that everything is rushed again, and it's very hard to see in transparent terms what the next step is. Greenpeace has been following and trying to prevent ocean dumping for many, many decades, and this kind of incident is a case in point as to why those international rules are so vital to have, so that we can have that scrutiny and that independent evaluation that doesn't seem perhaps to have happened so well in this case. Beyond that, I think we're keen that Mauritius looks again at its marine protected area provision. It's very, very low at the moment in terms of area. And it's an opportunity, I think, to review that, and also to look at the impacts of climate change and ocean acidification, and whether the marine protected area system can be adapted to account for also resilience to those kinds of changes. And then more broadly, again, of course, is the wider issue of reliance on fossil fuels. So as long as we have shipping traffic that is relying on fossil fuels as a means of propulsion and transporting lots of fossil fuels also in tankers, there will be spills. It's an inevitability. History has told us that. So we have to look more broadly at the contribution that cleaner shipping, moving away from fossil fuels, could make to climate change, to air pollution, and also to the ability to avoid these kinds of spills compounding whenever you have an accident. So Greenpeace is going to continue working in all those areas, working with our Protect the Oceans campaign, working to try and move countries more and more away from fossil fuels, to highlight those wider implications of climate change and ocean acidification. And we hope that, if nothing else, then this kind of incident can be even more of a catalyst for those sorts of changes going forward.
Thank you very much, David, for your insights and opinion. We're very grateful to have you on this platform in this together. And please continue monitoring the long-term impact of the WAKASHIO also. I think it's very important to have Greenpeace on that and advocating at all levels so that it really, that this incident can be avoided in the future, but we could also look at the protection of the ones that are most vulnerable from that oil spill. So thank you very much.